Story number 1. It was a scorching summer day. The wife asked her husband, Dennis, to go to her mother-in-law's house in the country and help her with the chores. At first he refused, but soon the idea became incredibly attractive to him. Especially attractive was the prospect of eating fresh homemade milk, cucumbers, tomatoes, and other vegetable garden goodies. However, it was not the produce and not the cottage cheese that caused his decision. The main prey was his mother-in-law. He had long secretly admired her, and his desire unconsciously became stronger and stronger. His mother-in-law was a worthy woman, skillful in everything she did. She was well-groomed, beautiful, and always cheerful. Watching his mother-in-law stroll gracefully down the street, Dennis couldn't resist casting a lustful glance at her. He genuinely liked her, so why not seize the opportunity? With that thought in mind, he gathered his things into the car, said goodbye to his wife with a kiss, and hit the road. It wasn't a long drive, and he reached his destination in just 2 hours. His mother-in-law lived on the outskirts of a village with a forest beyond the fence. It was a secluded place where there was not a single person. Upon arrival, they greeted warmly and exchanged the customary kiss on the lips. A shiver ran down Dennis' spine. They entered the house, and Dennis, thoroughly refreshed, was ready to get on with his day. The mother-in-law was not greedy, feeding her son-in-law so much that he could barely get out of his chair. After a little rest, he went out into the yard and admired the beauty surrounding him. At that moment, he could not help but think that he could live happily with his mother-in-law forever, so pleasant was the nature around him. He started chopping wood and stacking it carefully, not realizing that his mother-in-law was watching him from behind the curtain. She looked out the window and quickly disappeared, but eventually Dennis caught her gaze. This fact lifted his spirits, and he began to indulge in crazy dreams. He imagined entering the house and being greeted by his mother-in-law, who prepared a clean bed for him. In his fantasies, she would even join him in bed. They will surrender to their desires and be happy, and there will be whatever happens. When Dennis entered the house, however, he found it empty and quiet, with only the cat watching him intently. He called for his mother-in-law, but there was no answer. She finally appeared at the front door and explained that she preferred to sleep in the hayloft because of the heat. Dennis accepted her explanation without further question and wished her good night. Despite his reluctance to sleep, he washed his face and climbed into bed, staring at the ceiling. Sinful thoughts swarmed in his head, especially about the intimate moments he imagined sharing with his mother-in-law. However, how can I be the first to act? What if she takes offense? What if she slaps me in the face? What if she tells her daughter? Then it will be even worse. My wife will kill me. What am I supposed to do? Dennis was very tired as he had only slept half the night. He was restless and full of anger. He had a decision to make. We are not children. We are adults. We need to take action. He stood up, looked at himself in the mirror, and smoothed his hair with his hands. The excitement inside him was growing. He crept quietly into the hayloft. He looked around warily, as if someone was sneaking up on him. He sighed. With a creak, he opened the wooden door. Nothing could be seen in the darkness. Only a mouse squeaked somewhere. Dennis's heart pounded like a stray animal. Even his own ears were filled with the sound of his heartbeat. He spread the rustling hay with his hands and looked around. His eyes were gradually getting used to the darkness. His mother-in-law was nowhere to be seen. He continued creeping forward, trying to tread as quietly as possible so as not to frighten her. He sneezed unintentionally. The grass was so prickly, it tickled his nostrils and mouth. "Son-in-law, is that you?" He heard his mother-in-law's voice. "It's me. Who else would it be?" He answered in a hoarse voice, overflowing with excitement. "Can't you sleep?" "I can't sleep, mother-in-law." "Is it because you're thinking of me?" she asked, laughing. "About you, only about you," he answered firmly. "Yes, and I am tired of waiting for you, my favorite son-in-law." The mother-in-law whispered softly among the dry grass, and her voice was scarcely audible. At last he discerned her. She was lying on the hay, spreading her arms invitingly. Her gaze was playful, like a cat playing with a mouse. For a moment his son-in-law felt fear. It had been a long time since he had felt such feelings, except in his youth. But the mother-in-law remained unperturbed. Although at first she was embarrassed, her hesitation dissipated. They shared a long kiss, and from that moment Dennis could remember nothing else. The only thing he remembered was the pungent smell of grass, reminiscent of the forest witch's dwelling. He struggled to breathe, barely regaining consciousness. As he stepped out of the hayloft, he saw the moonlit sky and the silence with no one in sight. At that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of contentment and happiness. As he looked up at the night sky, he let out a roar like that of a wild stallion. The next evening, having finished their daily chores, they returned to the hayloft again. The first to enter was the mother-in-law, followed a short time later by the son-in-law. And everything unfolded the same way as the first time, only this time it was even better. He himself could not imagine that a man could experience real happiness. It is not without reason that they say that a mature woman is better than a young girl. Dennis thought about it. He had no remorse. It was not his fault that they were drawn to each other with such inexplicable force. It was an element, a longing between two people of opposite sexes that was far from ordinary. The fire consumed all of his insides, leaving his mind calm and empty. The thought of returning to the city, to his wife and children, was unbearable. The mere prospect of it made him want to howl with despair. How was he to forget what had happened the night before? Dennis was at a loss. His anger was so strong that he wanted to tear the hair out of his chest. And then his wife started calling, and repeatedly. "Come home," she said. "You're spending too much time there." How to go home? "We need to make new greenhouses, repair the roof, stone the path to the doorstep, thin the branches of the apple trees. I'll be busy with work for a week for sure." Dennis sighed, pretending to be tired, "But I'm ready to do anything for your mother, my favorite wife." She was delighted with such words, and bragged about me to her friends. She didn't know that it was not work that kept me busy, but her mother. We did all sorts of things in that delicious-smelling dry grass. If I told my friends about it, they'd find it unbelievable. It's like we've lost our minds. There's no other way to describe it. Dennis continued to stay with his mother-in-law for another week, and then a few more days. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't bring themselves to break up. Their love was too strong. However, he had no choice but to return home, even though he didn't want to. At home, Dennis felt incredibly depressed, and even his wife couldn't dispel his depression, not even at night. He longed for those days spent in the hayloft with his beloved mother-in-law. Story number 2. A few years ago, an interesting incident happened with my mother-in-law. It was at a time when I had just gotten my degree and was looking for a job. I received an invitation for an interview from the head of the department, Eliana. However, from the very beginning, I did not like her manner of communication very much. It was clear to me that I was dealing with a pushy woman. Throughout the internship, I became more and more convinced that my initial impression was correct. I had even underestimated my future boss's desire for power. "Kenneth, if you want to work here, you will do what I say and when I say it." This was her favorite response, despite my attempts to discuss the inconvenient schedule or the constant fixing of reports. She ignored my complaints. The appearance of my boss perfectly matched her image of a strict and authoritative figure, despite the fact that she was already in her 40s. Eliana always looked stunning. Impeccably tailored business suits and invariably high-heeled shoes emphasized her slender figure. She was a distant and unattainable dream, and in her piercing blue eyes, there was not a drop of warmth. A year later, Eliana was promoted and took a position as a lawyer in a well-known company. Frankly speaking, as time passed, I began to miss her very much. Such a woman involuntarily causes admiration, even if she is your boss. On New Year's Eve, my colleagues and I went to a bar for a drink, but in the midst of the fun, I felt lonely. Stepping aside, I thought I was hallucinating. Turning around, I saw Shirley, her beautiful eyes staring back at me, no longer angry. On the contrary, they sparkled with amusement. It was the daughter of my former boss. Our romance began at breakneck speed, and 7 months later, we were married. At the wedding, my mother-in-law looked gorgeous, but she was still cold to me. One night, when my wife was on duty at the hospital, I was awakened by the doorbell. I was stunned to see my mother-in-law on the doorstep. She was drunk and upset about something. "Ileana, what's wrong?" I asked her, honey. It was the first time she called me that. I'm exhausted, completely drained. Became impossible to hide my emotions. When she looked at me, there was no trace of coldness in her eyes. They were like a welcoming sea, inviting me to explore its depths. I saw her slightly open lips and realized that there was no turning back for me. That enchanting night, my snow queen, my dream, my former boss, and now my mother-in-law, became my lover, giving me an unforgettable feeling of warmth. However, I soon made a decision to end it all, as I felt ashamed in front of my wife. When I confessed to my mother-in-law, she strongly opposed my decision, saying that she had no other man in her life. She threatened that she would tell everything to her daughter. If we did not continue our secret meetings, she would make me guilty of everything. She was just blackmailing me. I am at a loss. What to do? Please, if someone has faced a similar situation, give advice on how to cope with this predicament and get rid of the influence of my mother-in-law. Story number 3. This incident took place in Florida in 1981. The weather was unexpectedly sunny and warm. A Buick or Lincoln was moving leisurely along the road to Fort Lauderdale. It had been a long time. Now you wouldn't know exactly which car it was. Behind the wheel sat an ordinary 60-year-old man, accompanied by his 48-year-old mother-in-law, the owner of a voluptuous figure and fiery red hair. In the back seat, his lawfully wedded wife slept peacefully. Despite his fatigue, Mr. Johnson kept his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing at his mother-in-law's lap. She was wearing a short summer dress, one leg swung over the other, allowing him to admire not only her knees, but something else as well. Mr. Johnson had long been attracted to Kimberly, and he felt no shame for that desire. He still considered himself young, fit, and full of vitality, able to charm both women without difficulty. The difficulty, however, was that his mother-in-law had strict and old-fashioned principles. Nevertheless, Mr. Johnson firmly believed that beneath her appearance lurked a passionate soul, just waiting to be ignited. After all, she had been a widow for 10 years and had not experienced the touch of a man, so she was ripe for caresses. Kimberly gazed out the window at the scenery with her brother-in-law, not concerned with traffic safety, but rather remembering her past. It was here that she had met her first love, a trucker named Thomas, with whom she had shared a special moment of her life on the beach. The memory of him sent a slight shiver down her spine and a pleasant warmth in her stomach. They were heading toward a spot near Fort Lauderdale where they planned to camp for the night. While Kimberly and her brother-in-law were immersed in their thoughts, Brenda, an accountant at a small firm, was sleeping peacefully. Brenda was dressed in a tight dress that fluttered in the wind, and her sandals were neatly spread out on the floor nearby. Despite the limited space in the car, she had managed to find a relatively comfortable spot for a good night's rest. A sudden jolt from a pothole made the car shudder, and Brenda opened her beautiful green eyes. She reached up, fixed her bright, stiff hair like her mother's, and sitting back in the seat, she said, "What a wonderful sunshine. I can't wait to get to the place to sunbathe and swim. I'm already tired from the road. My legs are stiff. I don't think we have far to go." "You're absolutely right, dear. Another hour and we'll be there. You don't know what a wonderful place Mr. Johnson is taking us to." My mother-in-law always called her son-in-law that out of respect, and you'll soon see it and fall in love with it. Besides, there's never anyone there, which means we can completely relax and get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The car turned off the main road and onto a rural path decorated with lush vegetation, typical of the southern region. After a while, our attention was caught by a blue flashing light signaling our arrival at a secluded and idyllic cove sheltered from prying eyes. Exhausted from the trip, the tired travelers finally got out of the cramped vehicle into the fresh air. Brenda lay down on a sun-warmed boulder, gazing dreamily at the waves rhythmically crashing against the shore. Meanwhile, Kimberly got food and drinks out of the trunk, fulfilling her role as a caring mother and mother-in-law, keeping the family fed. Scott immediately set about setting up a large tent that would accommodate the three of them. The untouched but incredibly cozy spot was beginning to take on a cozy ambiance. The tent was closer to the surrounding trees, and the smoke from the fire was gently billowing nearby. The kettle was making an inviting puffing sound, and there was even a rope strung up to dry the laundry. It was evident that the travelers had made a serious and prolonged stop here. Seizing the first opportunity, the women left their duties to their host, and, happily throwing off their dresses, rushed out to bathe in the sea. Mr. Johnson, keeping an eye on the soup, watched with adoration Brenda's and Kimberly, who were splashing merrily in the waves. Although he had been married for 2 years, the man was still pondering why this fiery-haired beauty had chosen him, given his age. However, it was undoubtedly his incredible charisma and charm that captivated his wife's heart, making her fall in love as a young girl. The wedding took place a few months later, and even his mother-in-law was thrilled to have such a wonderful and economic son-in-law. A few minutes later, Brenda emerged from the water and reclined on a towel, warming her young and graceful body in the warm sun. Her mother-in-law, on the other hand, didn't seem to have any intention of giving up swimming just yet. Meanwhile, Kimberly grabbed a large air mattress and eagerly went back out to engage in a prolonged battle with the waves, seeming to be sucked into the maelstrom for a long time. And decided to take advantage of hungry for female caresses son-in-law. Without wasting time, he approached his wife and began to caress her in the right places, from which her cheeks flushed and a smile appeared on her face. Then he took her with him into the tent. After a few minutes, distinct sounds came from inside. Unfortunately, they had to hurry as they could be caught at any moment, but the excitement and adrenaline rush made this activity even more exciting. However, their efforts to remain inconspicuous proved futile. The worried mother-in-law, noticing that there was no one on the beach, decided to check if everything was all right. As soon as she approached the tent, all her worries instantly vanished. Through the sunlit fabric of their shared dwelling, she saw her daughter and son-in-law in an unmistakable pose. There was no longer any doubt of their actions. What she saw and heard made her uneasy. Struggling with her own desires, the woman decided not to reveal that she had witnessed their game. She quietly withdrew to the shore and tried to cool her ardor in the refreshing ocean water. A few days later, however, a happy accident helped Kimberly find a solution to her loneliness and dissatisfaction. It was like this. Mr. Johnson had gone early in the morning to replenish the groceries in town, and Brenda had opted for a leisurely stroll along the shore. Kimberly, suffering from a headache, stayed in the tent. She covered herself with a blanket and dozed off. Unfortunately, Mr. Johnson's plans were disrupted when his car began to malfunction on the way to the store, forcing him to turn back and deal with an engine problem. Upon returning to the campground, he discovered that the woman was not at the beach. Peeking into the slightly ajar tent, he saw dainty toes and decided it was his wife and took the opportunity to slip inside. As she dozed off, Kimberly suddenly felt a hand slide down her thighs and heard her son-in-law's voice. "Surprised to see me back so soon, darling?" "I missed you," he whispered. At first taken aback, Kimberly succumbed to the pleasurable touch of her son-in-law's skillful hands, forgetting everything else for a moment. Overwhelmed with pleasure, she could only whisper, "Scott, what are you doing?" Momentarily stunned, The son-in-law hesitated before resuming his caresses, gradually breaking Kimberly's feeble attempts to resist. Eventually, the mother-in-law gave in to the urge, willingly giving in to the forbidden game, agreeing to everything. Story number 4. A few years ago, an interesting incident happened with my mother-in-law. It was at a time when I had just gotten my degree and was looking for a job. I received an invitation for an interview from the head of the department, Eliana. However, from the very beginning, I did not like her manner of communication very much. It was clear to me that I was dealing with a pushy woman. Throughout the internship, I became more and more convinced that my initial impression was correct. I had even underestimated my future boss's desire for power. "Kenneth, if you want to work here, you will do what I say and when I say it." This was her favorite response, despite my attempts to discuss the inconvenient schedule or the constant fixing of reports. She ignored my complaints. The appearance of my boss perfectly matched her image of a strict and authoritative figure, despite the fact that she was already in her 40s. Eliana always looked stunning. Impeccably tailored business suits and invariably high-heeled shoes emphasized her slender figure. She was a distant and unattainable dream, and in her piercing blue eyes, there was not a drop of warmth. A year later, Eliana was promoted and took a position as a lawyer in a well-known company. Frankly speaking, as time passed, I began to miss her very much. Such a woman involuntarily causes admiration, even if she is your boss. On New Year's Eve, my colleagues and I went to a bar for a drink, but in the midst of the fun, I felt lonely. Stepping aside, I thought I was hallucinating. Turning around, I saw Shirley, her beautiful eyes staring back at me, no longer angry. On the contrary, they sparkled with amusement. It was the daughter of my former boss. Our romance began at breakneck speed, and 7 months later, we were married. At the wedding, my mother-in-law looked gorgeous, but she was still cold to me. One night, when my wife was on duty at the hospital, I was awakened by the doorbell. I was stunned to see my mother-in-law on the doorstep. She was drunk and upset about something. "Eliana, what's wrong?" I asked her, honey. It was the first time she called me that. I'm exhausted, completely drained. Became impossible to hide my emotions. When she looked at me, there was no trace of coldness in her eyes. They were like a welcoming sea, inviting me to explore its depths. I saw her slightly open lips and realized that there was no turning back for me. That enchanting night, my snow queen, my dream, my former boss, and now my mother-in-law, became my lover, giving me an unforgettable feeling of warmth. However, I soon made a decision to end it all as I felt ashamed in front of my wife. When I confessed to my mother-in-law, she strongly opposed my decision, saying that she had no other man in her life. She threatened that she would tell everything to her daughter. If we did not continue our secret meetings, she would make me guilty of everything. She was just blackmailing me. I am at a loss. What to do? Please, if someone has faced a similar situation, give advice on how to cope with this predicament and get rid of the influence of my mother-in-law.